We talked earlier about the four things that you ought to pay special attention to in observation. Maybe you can review them right now, but we talked about terms, we talked about structure, we talked about type of literature, and atmosphere. What I want to do in this time is to talk about type of literature, or genre is another word that is used. Paying attention to the type of literature that you're involved with will often pay really good dividends and keep you from making mistakes in interpretation. I want to give you three examples of what we're talking about and how it becomes important. One is in the area of wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is a specific type of literature that can get you into trouble if you're not careful and you don't observe the fact that you're dealing with wisdom literature and it's something a little bit different. If you go through the notes, you'll see that we've given some guidelines and some warnings for the various types of literature. And wisdom literature, one of the warnings is not to take the wisdom statements as ironclad promises. They are intended to be more, this is the way that life generally works. It's not the way that life always works. It's the way that life ought to work in a perfect world, but the reality is that we don't live in a perfect world. So I want to pull a couple wisdom passages out for us and to compare them, and we should realize that we can't take the first one as a promise. So take a look at Proverbs chapter 22, and I want to read verses 4 and 5. Proverbs 22, verses 4 and 5. The reward of humility and the fear of the Lord are riches, honor, and life. Thorns and snares are in the way of the perverse. He who guards himself will be far from them. Now you could read that, and if you're not paying attention to the fact that we're dealing with wisdom literature, it's a specific type of literature, you could read that and think, godly people, wise people, are never going to have problems. They're going to have long lives, and they're going to be wealthy materially. Whereas on the other hand, ungodly people, unwise people, are going to die young, and they're going to cause themselves all kinds of problems. Now, generally speaking, that is true. That is the teaching of Proverbs. That is the teaching of the Bible. If you're wise, if you're godly, you're going to cause yourself less problems. You're going to have a better life. You're going to tend to do things a certain way that is going to lead to success. But does that mean that that's always going to be the case and you can take that to the bank? Well, let's take a look at another passage, Psalm 73, and I'll read several verses from this. A guy named Asaph, talking about his life, he says, I was envious of the arrogant as I saw the prosperity of the wicked. Now that should really throw us after the verses that we've just read. I was envious of the arrogant as I saw the prosperity of the wicked, for there are no pains in their death, and their body is fat. They are not in trouble as other men, nor are they plagued like mankind. Therefore pride is their necklace, and he goes on and talks about how they become even more arrogant. And then in verse 11, and they say, how does God know, and is there knowledge with the Most High? Behold, these are the wicked, and always at ease. They have increased in wealth. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure, and washed my hands in innocence, for I have been stricken all day long, and chastened every morning. Now that doesn't really sound like it goes together with the passage that we read earlier, Proverbs 22, 4 and 5. We have to realize that when we're talking about wisdom literature, we're talking about a type of revelation that is wise people looking at life and seeing how life works. Now in a perfect world, and how life normally works, and ultimately when we look at eternity, things will go well for the righteous, the wise person. Things will not go well for the ungodly, the foolish person. But we don't live in a perfect world. And we can find exceptions to the rule. And so we have passages like Psalm 673. We have entire books like the book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes, which were written probably to counterbalance this sort of naive approach to some of the statements that we find in Proverbs. So that's one particular type of literature or genre, is wisdom. Another one that we can get into trouble with is narrative. Narrative doesn't come out and make direct propositional statements like, say, Paul's letters might, or say some of Jesus' speeches might in the Gospels. So you have a story, and it's a story that's not just being told for the sake of, well, these are the stories we had and we're writing a history, but rather there are stories that are put together into a book in order to create a certain impression, to teach a certain understanding about God and man and the relationship between God and human beings. So, for example, Genesis 16 is a story where Abraham and Sarah have come into the promised land. They've had the promise that they're going to have a descendant, and in fact a multitude of descendants. They've been in the land of Canaan for 10 years. Abraham is now 75 years old. And Sarah comes up with the idea of giving her maid, her Egyptian maid, Hagar, to Abraham so that they can have children through Hagar. And the whole thing gets a bit confused. And so you try to work out, well, what is the point that this story is trying to teach? Because we're not really told. Well, the thing is that there are some clues that are given to us throughout the story. And at the end of the story, you start to get a lot of names and descriptions and uses of verbs having to do with seeing and hearing. Seeing and hearing. And the way I take this story is that it's trying to make the point that God sees and hears. So if we think about the theology of this story, we talked about theology at another time, or we will at another time, breaking theology down into three sections. So what do we learn about God? What's the vision of God? What do we learn about depraved human beings? And then what is the proper relationship between God and man? If we ask that first question, what do we learn about God? What we learn here is that God is the God who promises. God is the God who promises. And not only is he the God who promises, he's also the God who sees and hears. He's aware of what his people are going through. That's the primary vision of God. We ask the question, what do we learn about depraved human beings or sinful human beings? And what we learn is that human beings tend not to trust God. Human beings tend to take matters into their own hands and implement human strategies instead of trusting God. What's the relationship, the proper relationship between God and man? Well, the God who promises and the God who sees and hears should be related to by human beings by faith. And realizing that even though things may take time, God is in control, and he will work things out. He will bring his promises to pass in his own time. Sometimes what happens with narrative passages is when people come to interpret it, they pick up on some detail of the passage that may or may not be significant to the overall message of the passage, and they miss the big, comprehensive theological thrust that the story is trying to get across, and they focus on something that really isn't the main point. So that's an example of how being sensitive to the genre of narrative affects your interpretation. A third example, just real briefly, is the genre of law. So we have books like Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, which are essentially, especially the book of Deuteronomy, is laid out as a covenant. Archaeologists, scholars have studied ancient covenants, and what they've discovered is that Deuteronomy is laid out just like an ancient covenant of the ancient world, primarily like the Hittites' covenants. And what Deuteronomy is then, is it's the agreement, it's the covenant between the great King Yahweh and his servant people Israel, his servant nation Israel. Now, that is really helpful for us to pay attention to that being a particular genre, because we get to the New Testament and we realize we are actually under a new covenant The Old Covenant was between God in the Old Testament and his covenant people Israel. It's not primarily a covenant for us here today. So just 3 examples of how paying attention to the type of literature that we're dealing with can affect the way that we interpret a passage.